The massive chamber hummed with alien voices as thousands of beings from across the galaxy gathered in one place, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with their collective presence, and Commander Jake Morrison stood at the center of it all, wearing his crisp military uniform decorated with medals that meant absolutely nothing to these creatures. And beside him, Lieutenant Katie Sullivan kept her face blank, even though her jaw was clenched so tight it could crack stone, and around them sat representatives from 1,000 different worlds, and some looked like clouds of gas while others appeared as living crystals. And they all shared one thing in common, and that was their absolute certainty that humanity was nothing more than a cosmic joke. The Voltharian ambassador rose from his seat, and his 4 eyes blinked one after another in a pattern that Jake had learned meant contempt, and the translator device hanging from his neck crackled to life, and his words filled the chamber with mocking tones, and he asked how Earth could possibly believe that their primitive forces had anything to offer the coalition military, and his voice dripped with such dismissal that several other species chittered and buzzed their agreement. Jake kept his voice steady and calm when he responded, and he told them that the Special Air Service and other special operations forces had centuries of combat experience in every type of environment Earth could throw at them, and he explained that their soldiers had fought in deserts and jungles and mountains and cities, and they had learned to adapt to anything. The chamber erupted with laughter, and it rippled through the alien gathering like a wave, and the Kralix delegate leaned forward, and his body was made of living metal that reflected the lights around him, and he spoke with such condescension that it felt like a physical weight. And he said that Earth had not even mastered fusion technology yet, and that human weapons still used chemical propellants like something from the Stone Age, and that their tactics were designed only for fighting other weak humans. A Xanathi observer joined in, and her crystalline form split the light into rainbow patterns, and she told the chamber that they had reviewed human training protocols and found them laughable, and she said that human soldiers needed sleep every few hours and required food constantly and could not survive in even the most basic atmospheric conditions without artificial support, and she finished by questioning why Earth had even been given a seat at the council table in the first place. Katie's hand twitched toward the weapon at her side, and it was an instinctive movement that Jake caught immediately, and he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder to stop her. And he knew that violence here would only prove what these aliens already believed about humanity. Jake addressed the council again, and he told them with respect that humanity had not asked to join their war, and he reminded them that the coalition had come to Earth with their proposition, and that much was absolutely true because 3 months earlier, the Galactic Coalition had arrived at Earth with an ultimatum, and they had told humanity to join their fight against the Dravix horde or face extinction when the parasitic species eventually reached human space. The Voltharian sneered again, and he called it a courtesy and nothing more, and he declared that human forces would be placed in support roles, and he suggested logistics work or supply chain management, and he said that the actual fighting should be left to species that were bred for warfare, and his tone suggested that humanity should be grateful for even this small consideration. The entire council chamber erupted in agreement, and various species made their approval known through sounds that ranged from clicking to buzzing to electronic pulses, and they all seemed united in their certainty that humans were inferior in every measurable way. Jake looked at Katie for a moment, and then he turned back to face the council, and he simply said that they understood and that Earth would prepare their forces for deployment, and his tone gave away nothing of what he was thinking as they walked out of the chamber. Katie finally let her anger show, and she said they were treating Earth like children, and her voice was tight with frustration, and she asked how they were supposed to prove themselves when the aliens would not even give them a real chance. Jake kept walking, and he told her quietly to let them underestimate humanity, and he reminded her that the SAS had operated in shadows for over a century, and that being dismissed and overlooked was practically their specialty, and he pulled out his encrypted communication device and sent a single message back to Earth, and the message was simple, and it said to proceed with Operation Silent Thunder, and that the aliens would never see them coming. Back on Earth in a classified facility hidden deep beneath the Scottish Highlands, Captain Danny Wright received the message, and he allowed himself a grim smile, and around him 50 of the most elite soldiers that humanity had ever produced began their final preparations, and these men and women had been training for this exact moment since first contact with the Coalition, and they had studied every piece of intelligence on alien combat methods, and they had analyzed every weakness in the supposedly superior alien technology. And they had practiced and drilled and prepared for the moment when they could show the galaxy what humans were really capable of. Danny gathered his team in the briefing room, and he looked at each face, and he saw Sergeant Lisa Hayes checking her modified rifle with practiced efficiency, and Corporal Ben Miller going over demolition equipment with the care of a surgeon, and Private Greg Turner cleaning his scope for the 100th time, and Sergeant Sophie Clark running final diagnostics on their electronic warfare systems. And these were not just soldiers, and they were artists of warfare, and they had been forged in the fires of human conflict over thousands of years. He told them that the aliens thought humans were weak, and he said the Coalition believed that Earth forces were only good for carrying supplies, and he explained that every species in the galaxy had dismissed humanity as primitive children who barely deserved a seat at the table. And then he paused, and he let the anger in the room build, and he asked them if they were ready to teach the galaxy a lesson that it would never forget. The response was immediate, and it was not loud or boastful, and it was simply a series of nods and quiet affirmations, because these soldiers did not need to prove anything to each other, and they had already proven everything that mattered, and they knew what they were capable of, and soon the rest of the galaxy would know it too. Lisa spoke up, and she said that the aliens had better technology and better weapons and physical advantages that humans could never match. And she asked Danny how they were supposed to compete with species that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. Danny smiled, and he told her that technology was just tools and that weapons were just instruments, and what really mattered in combat was the mind behind the trigger. And he reminded them that humanity had climbed to the top of the food chain on a world that was actively trying to kill them every single day. And he said that Earth was a death world by galactic standards, and that humans had evolved to survive conditions that would kill most alien species. And he explained that what the Coalition saw as weakness was actually the greatest strength humanity possessed, and that was the ability to adapt. He pulled up holographic displays showing Coalition military doctrine, and he walked them through how the aliens fought, and their tactics were built around overwhelming force and superior technology and direct confrontation, and they expected their enemies to fight the same way, and when both sides followed the same rules, the side with better technology usually won, and that was how the Coalition had dominated the galaxy for thousands of years. But the Draviks did not follow those rules, and that was why the Coalition was losing, and the parasitic species adapted and changed and used unconventional tactics, and they turned every advantage against their enemies, and they were winning because they refused to play the game the way the Coalition expected. Danny told his team that humanity would do the same, and he said they would not fight like the Coalition, and they would fight like humans, and they would use every dirty trick and every unconventional tactic and every lesson learned from 10,000 years of human warfare. And he reminded them that special forces existed because conventional warfare did not cover every situation. And he said that being underestimated was not a weakness, and it was an advantage. The team spent the next 72 hours in final preparation, and they modified their equipment to interface with alien technology, and they memorized the layouts of Coalition ships and Draviks installations, and they drilled on communication protocols and emergency procedures, and they prepared for every contingency they could imagine, and they knew that once they deployed there would be no support and no backup and no second chances. Part 2. The Coalition dropship shook violently as it cut through the atmosphere of Kelrak 7, and inside the troop bay, Captain Danny Wright sat in silence while towering Voltharian shock troopers surrounded his team, and the aliens had not stopped mocking the humans since they left the fleet, and their translator devices filled the cramped space with insults and contempt. One massive Voltharian leaned toward Danny and told him to try not to die too quickly because they needed someone to carry extra ammunition, and his 4 eyes blinked in that pattern that Danny now recognized as laughter. And several other shock troopers joined in with their own jokes about weak humans who would probably run at the first sign of real combat. Sergeant Lisa Hayes sat across from Danny, and she did not even look up from her weapon inspection, and her modified rifle had been reverse-engineered from Coalition technology, but it maintained the reliability that human weapons were known for, and she told the Voltharian in a flat voice that they would try their best, and her tone suggested she could not care less what the aliens thought. The Voltharian commander named Grexus stomped to the center of the bay, and his forearms gestured at a holographic display that showed the layout of the mining colony below, and he explained that this was a simple extraction mission and that they needed to rescue the mining supervisors who were trapped in the central facility. And he said the Draviks had overrun the perimeter defenses but had not yet breached the core structure, and he told them the plan was to go in hard and fast and eliminate all hostiles and extract the survivors before the Draviks could kill them. Danny raised his hand and asked about civilian casualties, and he wanted to know what would happen to the workers and families who lived in the colony. Grexus turned his 4 eyes on Danny, and his expression showed irritation, and he said that the civilians were already dead or converted, and that they would only extract the supervisors because those individuals had strategic knowledge, and everyone else was expendable, and his tone made it clear that he considered this obvious. Corporal Ben Miller asked what converted meant, and his hand rested on the demolition charges attached to his vest. Grexus explained that the Draviks were parasitic organisms, and that they consumed neural tissue and used the bodies as hosts. And once a person was converted, there was no saving them, and the only mercy was a quick death. And he turned away from the humans and told them to stay behind the shock troopers and to try not to slow everyone down. The dropship hit the ground with a shriek of metal, and the ramp dropped open, and immediately the Voltharian shock troopers charged out with their energy weapons already firing, and they did not bother to identify targets or check their surroundings, and they just ran forward, shooting at anything that moved. Danny held up his fist, and his team froze at the top of the ramp, and he told them quietly to let the Voltharians go. And Lisa already had her thermal scope up, and she was scanning the colony structures with practiced efficiency. She reported that she was seeing 50+ heat signatures in the buildings, but the movement patterns did not match the Draviks' profiles from their intelligence briefings, and she said the contacts were moving too deliberately and with too much coordination. Danny said immediately that it was an ambush and that the whole mission was a trap, and he started to warn the Voltharians, but before he could transmit the message, the first building exploded, and the shock troopers who were caught in the open plaza scattered in panic as Draviks warriors poured out of hidden positions, and these were not the mindless drones that Coalition intelligence had described, and they moved with tactical precision, and they used cover, and they coordinated their fire like trained soldiers. Ben muttered that the briefings were completely wrong, and that the Draviks were learning and adapting, and that made them far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Grexus was screaming orders over the communication channel, and his troops were firing wildly in all directions, and 3 Voltharians went down in the first 30 seconds, and their personal shields were overwhelmed by concentrated plasma fire, and the remaining shock troopers were pinned down with no cover and no plan, and they were dying because they had expected an easy fight. Danny made his decision in a fraction of a second, and he told his team that they were not going to die for Voltharian arrogance, and he ordered Lisa and Ben to take positions on the ridge overlooking the plaza and to establish overlapping fields of fire, and he told Sophie Clark and Greg Turner to come with him because they were going to show these aliens what real tactical doctrine looked like. The human team moved like water flowing downhill, and they were fluid and silent and purposeful, and while the Voltharians fought in the open and made themselves easy targets, the SAS operators used every bit of cover and every shadow and every angle that gave them an advantage, and they moved through. The colony, like ghosts, Sergeant Sophie Clark was their communications specialist, and she immediately hacked into the local network, using techniques she had developed over years of electronic warfare training, and within seconds, she had access to security camera feeds that were still operational throughout the colony. She reported that she had eyes on the building interiors and that the supervisors were still alive, but there was a Draviks heavy unit moving toward their position, and she estimated 3 minutes until contact. Danny asked if they could reach the supervisors before the creatures did, and his mind was already working through options and contingencies. Sophie said not through the front because the Voltharians were completely pinned down, and any approach through the plaza would be suicide. But then she paused and studied the network schematics, and she said that mining tunnels beneath the colony connected to the central facility, and there was an access point 30 meters to their left. Danny smiled and he said that Grexus had told them not to slow the shock troopers down, but he had never said they could not finish the mission first, and he ordered his team to move out. They slipped away from the main battle and nobody noticed them leave because the Voltharians were too busy trying not to die, and the Draviks were too focused on their primary targets, and the humans found the tunnel access exactly where Sophie said it would be, and Ben made quick work of the locked hatch with a shaped charge that barely made a sound. Inside the tunnels it was dark and cramped, and the passages had been built for mining drones rather than soldiers. But this was exactly the kind of environment that SAS operators excelled in, and tight spaces and limited visibility were advantages when you knew how to use them. Danny ordered night vision activated and told his team to maintain combat spacing, and Sophie guided them through the tunnel network, using the facility schematics she had pulled from the network, and they moved with practiced efficiency. And their weapons were up and ready, and they checked every corner, and they communicated with hand signals when possible to maintain noise discipline. Lisa whispered that she had contact front, and 3 Draviks warriors appeared at a tunnel intersection, and their insectoid bodies moved on 6 legs, and neural parasites were visible through their translucent carapaces, and they had not noticed the humans yet because they were focused on reaching the surface. The SAS team opened fire as one unit, and their suppressed weapons made quiet coughing sounds, and all 3 Draviks went down before they could raise an alarm, and the operators moved past the bodies without breaking stride, because stopping to examine kills was how you got killed yourself. They emerged inside the central facility through a maintenance shaft, and they came up right into the supervisor shelter, and the 4 alien supervisors looked up in shock as human soldiers appeared through a hole in the floor. Danny told them calmly that they were Earth forces and that they were there to extract them, and he said to stay quiet and stay close and do exactly what he told them to do. Outside the shelter, the Draviks heavy unit was breaching the main door, and they were using plasma cutters to slice through the reinforced barriers, and they expected to find terrified supervisors cowering inside, but instead, they got a deadly crossfire as the SAS team opened fire from behind while the facility automated defenses engaged from the front, and the heavy unit was caught completely by surprise and went down hard. Sophie reported that their extraction route was now compromised, and that multiple Draviks units were moving to cut them off, and the tunnel they had used to enter was no longer safe. On the final night before deployment, Danny sat alone in his quarters, and he thought about the journey that had brought him here. And he had joined the military at 18, and he had worked his way through selection for the SAS, and he had served in a dozen conflicts across Earth, and he had seen the best and worst of humanity, and he had never imagined that he would end up fighting aliens in space. But here he was, and he was ready. The next morning, the team boarded the transport that would take them to the Coalition fleet, and as Earth fell away behind them, Katie Sullivan watched from the observation deck, and she had argued with Jake about going with the team, but he had refused, and he had told her that she was too valuable as a liaison with the Coalition command, and he had said that Danny and his team needed to do this alone, because if other humans were involved, the aliens would claim that it was not a fair test. The transport docked with the Coalition flagship, and Danny led his team through corridors filled with alien species who stared at them with barely concealed contempt. And they reached their assigned quarters, which were cramped and poorly maintained and clearly meant for species the Coalition did not value. And Danny just smiled, and he told his team that this was perfect because it meant the aliens were not paying attention to them, and that was exactly where they wanted to be. In the command center, Admiral Kess reviewed the deployment orders, and she was assigning human forces to support roles just as the Council had demanded, and she felt a twinge of something that might have been guilt, because these humans had traveled across the galaxy to help, and she was treating them like servants. But orders were orders, and the Council had been very clear. What Admiral Kess did not know was that Danny Wright and his team had no intention of following those orders, and they had their own mission and their own plan, and they were about to show the Galactic Coalition that humanity's greatest weapon was not technology or strength, and it was the simple fact that humans never played by anyone's rules but their own. Part 3A's, they loaded the supervisors into the mining transport. Danny's communication device crackled to life, and it was Grexus, and the Voltharian commander's voice was strained with pain and something that sounded like grudging respect, and he said that his unit was cut off from extraction, and he requested immediate assistance from the human team. Danny looked at his team, and they were exhausted and low on ammunition, and they had already accomplished their mission, and the smart tactical decision was to leave the Voltharians to their fate, because those same aliens had shown absolutely no concern for human lives and had treated them like servants and pack animals since the moment they met. Lisa met his eyes, and she knew exactly what he was thinking, and she said quietly that humans were not like them, and her voice was firm and certain. Danny nodded because that was the difference between humanity and the rest of the galaxy, and humans did not leave people behind even when those people were arrogant aliens who had mocked them and dismissed them and treated them with contempt, and that was what separated soldiers from everyone else. He activated his communication device and told Grexus to send his coordinates and that the human team was coming for them. Ben the Kralik supervisor said that Danny was insane and that the mission was complete and that additional risk was completely illogical and that they should proceed to extraction immediately. Ben said with a grim smile that humans were not always logical and that sometimes they did things just because it was the right thing to do. The mining transport roared through the colony streets, and Sophie drove with reckless precision, and she threw the heavy vehicle around corners and through obstacles while the rest of the team hung from the sides with their weapons ready. And they found the Voltharians pinned down in a plaza and surrounded on 3 sides by Dravik's forces. Greg observed that they could not fight through 200 hostiles, and that even with perfect tactics the numbers were against them. Danny said they did not need to fight through the enemy, and they just needed to give the Voltharians an opening to escape. And he asked Ben if he remembered the trick they had used in Syria during their last deployment on Earth. Ben's face split into a wild grin, and he said that was the operation that got them both demoted and brought up on charges. And Danny said it was also the operation that saved 40 civilians from a terrorist stronghold. While the team laid down suppressing fire to keep the Draviks focused elsewhere, Ben worked quickly with the remaining explosives in his kit, and he rigged them to the mining transport along with several fuel cells from damaged vehicles that were scattered around the area, and Sophie programmed a simple route into the transport navigation system. She muttered that this plan was either brilliant or suicidal, and probably both at the same time. Lisa replied that those were the best kind of plans and that anything worth doing was worth overdoing. They sent the transport rolling toward the Dravik's positions on autopilot, and it picked up speed as it crossed the plaza, and the enemy forces noticed it and concentrated their fire on the large moving target, exactly as the humans had planned, and the transport made it halfway across the open ground before the combined plasma fire from dozens of weapons caused the fuel cells to rupture. The explosion was massive and spectacular, and it created a fireball that rose 50 meters into the air, and the Dravik's line collapsed into chaos as warriors scrambled away from the flames, and the blast had killed at least 30 of them and wounded dozens more. Danny shouted into the communication channel for the Voltharians to move now, while the enemy was disorganized, and he told them to run for the human position. Grexus led his remaining shock troopers in a desperate sprint across the plaza, and they fired as they ran, and their discipline had returned now that they had hope of survival. And the SAS team provided precision cover fire, and every shot counted because ammunition was running low, and they could not afford to waste a single round. The Voltharians reached the human position just as coalition gunships finally arrived overhead, and the aircraft screamed across the sky and began providing air support, and the Draviks, caught between ground fire and aerial bombardment, retreated into the colony depths. On the gunship ride back to the fleet, Grexus approached Danny, and the Voltharian commander's armor was scorched black, and one of his 4 arms hung useless at his side, and his face showed pain, but also something deeper, and he told Danny that the humans had saved his warriors after the way the Voltharians had treated them, and he asked why. Danny looked at his exhausted team and then back at Grexus, and he said that was what soldiers did, and that they did not leave people behind, and it did not matter if those people were human or alien or had been disrespectful, because when someone needed help, you gave it. Grexus was silent for a long moment, and then he performed a gesture that Danny recognized from his cultural briefings as a sign of deep respect among Voltharian people, and he said that he had misjudged humanity, and that all of them had been wrong about Earth. Danny said that yes, they really had been wrong, and his voice was tired but not angry. As the gunship docked with the fleet carrier news of the mission, was already spreading through the coalition forces, and the human special forces team had not just completed their objective, but they had done it while the supposedly superior alien shock troopers had failed, and then they had risked everything to save those same aliens who had mocked them. In the coalition command center, military leaders from a dozen species were reviewing the mission footage in stunned silence, and they watched the recordings over and over, and they saw how the humans moved and how they thought and how they turned every disadvantage into an advantage. Admiral Kess was a Xenathi, and her crystalline form refracted light in patterns that showed deep thought, and she had been among the most vocal critics of human involvement in the war. And she watched the tactical recordings 3 times before she finally spoke, and she said to get Commander Jake Morrison immediately because they needed to discuss a fundamental change in strategy. Jake arrived at the command center within the hour, and he had been waiting for this moment, and he knew that actions spoke louder than words, and that one successful mission was worth 1,000 speeches about human capability. Kess told him that she owed humanity an apology, and her light pattern showed genuine remorse, and she explained that the coalition had been fighting the Draviks for 12 years, and in that time they had lost 14 colony worlds and billions of lives, and they had applied overwhelming force and superior technology and advanced tactics, and yet they continued to lose ground. Jake said diplomatically that coalition soldiers were brave, but that courage without adaptability was just expensive. Martyrdom. Kess's light patterns flickered with what might have been amusement, and she said that Captain Wright's team had accomplished in 4 hours what the best coalition units could not achieve in 3 days, and they had done it with equipment the coalition considered primitive, and she said that the council needed to understand why this was possible. Jake pulled up holographic displays, and he told her that coalition forces fought like they were playing a game with fixed rules, and they relied on overwhelming firepower and direct assaults and victory through technological superiority. And it worked well when facing enemies who played the same game. Kess said that the Draviks did not play by rules, and understanding was dawning in her voice. Jake said that neither did humans, and he explained that Earth Special Forces existed because conventional warfare did not cover every situation, and he said they were trained to think unconventionally and to use terrain and psychology and creativity as weapons, and he told her that coalition shock troopers were excellent hammers. But when every problem looked like a nail, you missed other solutions. Kess studied the mission recordings again, and she watched Lisa Hayes use the colony security system against the Draviks, and she saw Ben Miller turn a mining transport into an improvised weapon, and she began to understand what Jake was telling her. She said that humans fought like the Draviks did, and that they adapted and used unconventional tactics. Jake corrected her gently and said that humans fought like humans did, and he explained that his species had spent 10,000 years fighting each other on a world that was actively trying to kill them, and they had learned to be creative or die. And he said that was not primitive, and that was experienced. Over the next week, the coalition command structure underwent a quiet revolution, and more human teams were deployed, and they were embedded with alien units, not as support personnel, but as tactical advisors, and Sergeant Lisa Hayes found herself teaching Voltharian commandos about stealth operations, and Corporal Ben Miller ran demolitions workshops for Kralix engineers and showed them how to turn common materials into effective weapons. Danny said then they would make a new route, and he turned to Ben and reminded him that he had wanted to see how alien architecture handled human explosives, and now was his chance to find out. Ben grinned and started pulling charges from his vest, and he told Danny that this was going to be loud and probably bring down half the building, but it would definitely get them out. Danny said loud was fine, because subtle had stopped being an option the moment the Dravik's heavy unit had sounded the alarm, and he told Ben to blow the eastern wall and make them a door. The explosion tore through the facility wall and created a massive cloud of dust and debris that provided perfect concealment, and Danny led the supervisors through the gap while his team formed a protective diamond around them, and they moved fast but controlled, and every operator knew their role and their sector of responsibility. One of the supervisors was a Kralix named Ven, and his metallic body reflected the fires burning around them, and he protested that this was insane and that they should wait for the shock troopers to fight their way to them. Lisa told him without any emotion in her voice that the shock troopers were about 30 seconds from being completely overrun, and that the human team was his only chance of survival. She was not exaggerating, because through their tactical network, The SAS team could hear the Voltharian communication channels, and they were dissolving into panic, and Grexus was screaming orders to retreat, and his forces were scattered and taking heavy casualties, and the disciplined military unit had become a mob of individuals trying to survive. The human team moved through the back sections of the colony, and they avoided the main battle entirely, and this was what they had trained for since they were young, and operating behind enemy lines and extracting high-value targets and succeeding where conventional forces failed, and they had done this 100 times on Earth against human opponents, and doing it against aliens was really not that different. Ben called out that there were multiple hostiles on the rooftops, and he could see Dravik's warriors taking positions to ambush their route. Greg Turner replied that he saw them too, and his modified rifle barked twice, and 2 Draviks tumbled from their perches, and he reported the route was clear. They reached the colony vehicle depot where mining transports sat abandoned, and Sophie immediately moved to the nearest one, and her fingers flew over the alien control interface, and she had spent weeks studying coalition technology and learning how their systems worked. Danny asked if she could hotwire the transport, and he was covering their rear while Ben and Greg kept watch on the flanks. Sophie said it was already done, and that alien security systems were surprisingly straightforward once you understood the basic protocols, and the transport rumbled to life, and she told everyone to get in, and that the ride would not be comfortable, but it would get them to the extraction point. Not everyone was happy about this change, and in the coalition officer lounge a group of Voltharian commanders gathered, and their mood was dark and bitter. Commander Thexus, who was Grexus's superior officer, growled that this was humiliating, and that they were being lectured on warfare by primitives who had only just learned to leave their own planet. Another officer pointed out that those primitives had saved Grexus's entire unit from destruction. Thexus said it was a lucky mission and nothing more, and that the humans would fail eventually, and then the council would remember who the real warriors were, but that failure did not come, and the human teams kept succeeding and kept innovating and kept proving that Earth approach to warfare had real value and private. Greg Turner led a combined force that retook a Dravik's-occupied communications hub using tactics no coalition commander had considered, and Sergeant Sophie Clark's intelligence work uncovered a Dravik supply route that had operated undetected for months. 3 weeks after the Kelrak 7 mission, a major Dravik's hive was located on Vertex Prime, and it was a jungle world at the edge of coalition space, and traditional assault plans estimated 70% casualties for any attack force. Admiral Kess called an unprecedented meeting, and she brought together coalition military leadership and Earth Special Forces commanders, and she told them that they needed a new approach to this problem. Part 4 Commander Jake Morrison stood before the assembled coalition military leadership, and he pulled up tactical displays of Vertex Prime, showing the jungle world where a major Dravik's hive had been discovered, and Captain Danny Wright stood beside him, and around the briefing room sat commanders from a dozen different species, and for the first time, they were actually listening to what the humans had to say. Danny stepped forward, and he began explaining how standard coalition doctrine would handle this situation. And he said that normally they would hit the hive with orbital bombardment, and then send in heavy armor and shock troopers, and the goal would be to overwhelm the enemy with superior force. Commander Thexus nodded and asked what else anyone would do besides attack with maximum force. Danny said that humans would not attack the hive at all, and at least not directly, and he zoomed in on the terrain surrounding the target area, and he explained that the Draviks needed 3 things to maintain a hive, and those were food and water and a specific atmospheric composition for their breeding chambers. And he said that if you took away any of these 3 things, the hive would collapse from within. He outlined a plan that made several alien commanders visibly uncomfortable, and he described small teams infiltrating the jungle and sabotaging the hive support infrastructure. And he said there would be no massive battles and no heroic charges, and just patient, methodical destruction of the enemy ability to survive. Thexus protested that this could take weeks, and he asked where the honor was in such tactics, and his voice showed that he considered this approach cowardly. Lisa Hayes spoke up, and her voice was blunt, and she said that honor did not bring soldiers home alive, and that results did, and she asked Thexus how many of his warriors he was willing to sacrifice for honor. The Voltharian commander had no answer to that question. Jake Morrison stood, and he addressed Admiral Kess directly, and he told her to give them 2 weeks, and he said that if they could not collapse the hive without a major assault, then they would support whatever conventional operation she planned. Kess's crystalline form showed light patterns of calculation, and she was weighing risks against potential gains, and she finally said that she would agree to this plan, but that she was sending observers with the human teams because the coalition needed to see how these tactics actually worked in the field. Danny said he understood and that they would teach the observers everything they knew about human warfare. What the coalition observers learned over the next 2 weeks fundamentally changed how they viewed combat, and they watched human operators move through hostile jungle without being detected, and they saw them turn the environment itself into a weapon, and they witnessed tactics that prioritized intelligence and patience over raw firepower. Grexis himself volunteered to accompany Danny's team, and the Voltharian commander, who had once mocked humans, now moved through the jungle beside them. And he learned to read terrain, and to move quietly, and to think before shooting. And it was a completely different approach to warfare than anything he had been taught. During a rest period, Grexis spoke quietly with Danny, and he said that in Voltharian military academies they studied the great battles and glorious victories and heroic last stands, but he had noticed that humans seemed to study defeats, and he asked if that was true. Danny replied that every defeat was a lesson if you survived to learn from it, and he said that humanity had experienced a lot of defeats over the centuries, and they had learned from all of them so they would not keep making the same mistakes. Grexis said quietly that this was wisdom, and his tone showed genuine respect. The human teams worked systematically through the jungle, and they identified the water sources that fed the hive, and they introduced biological agents that were harmless to most species, but deadly to Dravik's physiology, and they found the food supply routes and poisoned them with toxins designed in Earth laboratories, and they located the atmospheric generators that maintained the breeding chamber environment, and they sabotaged them in ways that would not be noticed until it was too late. Sophie Clark led the electronic warfare effort, and she hacked into the hive communication network and planted false information that caused the Draviks to redirect warriors away from critical areas, and she created phantom threats that made them waste resources responding to attacks that never came. Ben Miller taught the coalition engineers how to create improvised explosives from jungle materials, and he showed them that you did not need advanced technology to cause devastating damage if you understood chemistry and physics and creative thinking. Greg Turner trained alien snipers in patience and observation, and he taught them that sometimes the most important thing a soldier could do was not shoot, and that gathering information was often more valuable than eliminating a single target. Lisa Hayes worked with the combat teams on movement techniques, and she showed them how to use camouflage and terrain and timing to become invisible even in the middle of enemy territory. And the alien soldiers were amazed at how humans could simply disappear when they wanted to. On the 14th day, the Dravik's hive on Vertex Prime collapsed, and the breeding chambers, deprived of their precise atmospheric requirements, began to fail, and the eggs died, and the young warriors never hatched, and the food supply routes poisoned with Earth-designed toxins killed hundreds of adult warriors, and the water sources contaminated with biological agents made thousands more sick and weak. The hive mind realized too late that it was dying, and it sent its remaining warriors into a desperate exodus, trying to escape the failing hive and flee to safety. But coalition forces were positioned and ready and prepared defensive positions, and they destroyed the fleeing Draviks with coordinated fire. The total coalition casualties were 47 wounded and 0 dead, and in any previous operation against a hive this size, thousands would have died and entire units would have been wiped out. Admiral Kess addressed the entire fleet that evening, and her transmission reached every coalition vessel in the sector, and she said that they had learned an important lesson, and she explained that true strength was not measured in weapons or numbers, but in wisdom and creativity, and the courage to admit when you were wrong. She continued and said that the humans had shown them a better way to fight, and that from this moment forward, Earth Special Forces would be integrated into all coalition military operations, with full authority to modify tactics as they saw fit. And she finished by saying that anyone who had a problem with this could file their complaints directly with her, and she would personally explain why they were wrong. The message was clear to everyone in the fleet, and humanity had earned its place not through superior technology or physical strength, but through superior thinking and adaptability. In the weeks that followed, human operators became sought-after additions to coalition task forces, and commanders who had once dismissed Earth forces now requested them specifically, and alien soldiers who had mocked human weakness now trained alongside them eagerly. Jake Morrison met with Danny Wright in the officer lounge, and they shared a drink, and Jake said that 6 months ago, the galaxy thought humanity was a joke, and now they were reshaping how the coalition fought its wars. Danny said that they had just shown the aliens what humans had always known, and that technology was useful, but creativity was essential, and that the species that survived was not the strongest or the fastest, but the one that adapted best. Lisa joined them, and she reported that 3 more hive worlds had been identified, and that Coalition Command was requesting human-led operations for all of them. And she said that other species were beginning to adopt human tactics and modify them for their own physiology and culture. Part 5. The war reached its critical point 6 months after the Verdux Prime operation, and the Draviks had been pushed back on multiple fronts. But they were not defeated, and now they were preparing for one massive, desperate assault and intelligence. Reports showed 3,000 Draviks vessels converging on a single target, and that target was Sanctuary. Sanctuary was the Coalition's most heavily populated core world, and 12 billion souls lived there, representing 47 different species. And if it fell, the Coalition would collapse and member worlds would sue for individual peace and cede territory to save themselves. And the Draviks knew this, and they were betting everything on one decisive battle. Commander Jake Morrison stood in the Fleet Command Center, surrounded by holographic displays that showed the approaching enemy armada, and the scale of it was terrifying. And beside him, Admiral Kess watched the projections with her crystalline form, showing light patterns of deep concern. She said that the Draviks were betting everything on this assault, and that if they took Sanctuary, the Coalition would fragment and fall apart. Jake asked what would happen if the Draviks lost this fleet instead. Kess replied that their capacity for offensive operations would end, and that the Coalition would have 5 to 10 years to rebuild before the enemy could threaten them again. But her light patterns showed doubt, and she said that defense projections were not favorable, and that, even with human tactics, they were outnumbered 3 to 1. Captain Danny Wright entered the command center, and his SAS team was behind him, and over the past months, they had become legendary throughout the Coalition fleet, and aliens who had once mocked them now stepped aside with respect. Danny said without any preamble that they had an idea, and that it was probably crazy and definitely impossible and violated about 40 different tactical doctrines. Jake smiled and said that sounded like a normal operation for human special forces. Danny pulled up intelligence reports his team had compiled over months of fighting, and he said they had been studying Dravik's hive behavior extensively, and he explained that the enemy operated on a distributed network, but there was always a prime node and a central intelligence that coordinated all the others. Admiral Kess said that they called this the Hive Mother, and that Coalition scientists had theorized about her existence, but she had never been located, and she could be anywhere in Dravik's controlled space. Lisa Hayes stepped forward, and she said that the Hive Mother was not in Dravik's space, and that she was with the fleet, and that she had to be because an operation this large required real-time coordination, and Dravik's communications had light-speed delay, just like everyone else. Sophie Clark activated a holographic display, and it showed communication patterns within the approaching Dravik's armada, and she explained that every ship in the fleet received orders, but there was one vessel that never received anything and only transmitted, and she said it was subtle and hidden in standard fleet communications. But the pattern was there. She highlighted a massive bioship at the center of the enemy formation, and it was twice the size of any other Dravik's vessel and heavily protected by overlapping shield spheres and surrounded by an entire battle group of escort ships. Danny said that was the Hive mothership, and that if they killed her, the entire fleet would lose coordination and the ships would revert to individual hive minds and fight independently, without central strategy. Commander Thexus, who had become one of humanity's strongest advocates, said that getting to that ship would require fighting through 3 layers of defenses, and that a fleet engagement would alert the enemy long before they could strike the target. Danny said they were not using the fleet and that they would use one ship instead, and something small and fast that could mimic Dravik's biosignatures. And he said they would get inside the enemy formation and board the Hive Mother vessel and eliminate her directly. The command center erupted in protests, and alien commanders said it was impossible and suicidal and completely insane. But Jake was studying the plan carefully, and his tactical mind was working through the possibilities. He asked how they would mimic a Dravix biosignature. Ben Miller grinned, and he said that they had been collecting Dravix bodies from battlefields for months, and that they had been reverse engineering enemy biology, and he explained that they could coat a ship in organic compounds that would read as Dravix to enemy sensors, and he admitted it would not hold up to close inspection, but if they moved with purpose like they belonged there, the enemy might not look too closely until it was too late. Kess said slowly that they wanted to disguise a coalition ship as a Dravix vessel and just fly into the middle of the enemy fleet. Jake explained that humans called it a Trojan horse maneuver, and it was named after an ancient Earth military deception, and he said it only worked if your enemy was arrogant enough to think they had already. One Grexus rumbled that the Dravix were definitely that arrogant, but he pointed out that the team that went inside probably would not make it back out. Danny agreed calmly, and he said that 12 billion people on Sanctuary versus 50 operators was a trade worth making. Over the next 48 hours they prepared the operation, and a coalition stealth corvette was modified with Dravix bio-coating, and its crew compartment was stripped to accommodate the strike team, and they assembled. 50 operators and 30 were humans from various special forces units, and 20 were alien volunteers who had trained alongside the humans and learned their methods. Private Greg Turner checked his rifle one final time, and the weapon had served him through dozens of operations, and he said that when he joined the military, he thought he would retire on Earth and maybe teach marksmanship to new recruits. And he said fighting aliens in space was not exactly what the recruitment materials had promised. Lisa Hayes was writing a letter using old-fashioned pen and paper, and it would be sent to her family if she did not return, and she said that none of this had been in anyone's plans, but that humans were good at adapting to unexpected situations. Sergeant Sophie Clark was making final adjustments to their electronic warfare systems, and she said she had loaded every virus and every hack and every dirty cyber trick she knew, and if she could access the Hive Mother neural network, even for a few seconds, she could create enough chaos to give them an opening. Captain Danny Wright gathered the team for final briefing, and he looked at these soldiers, both human and alien, and he felt deep pride because 6 months ago they had been separate species who barely trusted each other, and now they were a united force bonded by shared combat and mutual respect. He told them quietly that they all knew what this mission was, and that it was a one-way trip for a long-shot chance to end the war, and he said if anyone wanted to back out, now was the time, and there would be no shame in it. Nobody moved and nobody spoke, and they were all committed. Danny said he figured as much, and he told them it was time to go. Save some lives. A stealth corvette designated Ghost Runner launched from the Coalition fleet under complete radio silence, and it accelerated toward the Dravix Armada, and its false biosignature was broadcasting that it was a scout vessel returning with intelligence on the bridge. Jake Morrison monitored their approach, and he had insisted on commanding the operation personally over Danny's objections, and he had said that some things you led from the front. The Dravix fleet loomed before them, and 3,000 vessels of organic technology pulsed with hostile life, and the Ghost Runner slipped between patrol groups and moved with confidence and broadcast the correct challenge codes that Sophie had extracted from captured enemy computers. Sophie reported that the Dravix were hailing them and demanding authentication. Protocols. Jake ordered her to send the prepared response. She transmitted the data burst, and for 10 agonizing seconds nothing happened, and then the hailing stopped. Sophie said with relief in her voice that they were through the outer perimeter. They navigated deeper into the fleet formation, and every minute brought them closer to the Hive Mother massive bioship and closer to detection, and Grexus stood at the weapons console ready to activate every system the instant their cover was compromised. Ben arrived with Greg and Sophie, and the team sat together and they talked about the strange journey that had brought them here. And 6 months ago, they had been training in Scotland, preparing to prove themselves to a galaxy that did not believe in them, and now they were teaching that same galaxy how to win a war. Sophie said that the Dravix were adapting too, and that their intelligence showed the enemy was changing tactics in response to human methods, and she warned that this war was Far from over, Danny agreed and said that the Draviks had been winning, because they adapted faster than the Coalition, but now humanity had introduced a new variable, and the enemy would have to adapt to human unpredictability, and that was something they had never faced before. Greg asked what happened when the Draviks learned to counter human tactics, and he wondered if the advantage would disappear. Jake smiled and said that was the beauty of the human approach, and he explained that they were not teaching the Coalition one set of tactics, but rather teaching them how to think creatively, and how to adapt constantly, and how to never stop learning. And he said that was something the Draviks could not counter, because there was no fixed pattern. To defend against the conversation continued late into the night, and these soldiers who had once been dismissed as primitive had become the most valuable assets in the Coalition military, and they had proven that humanity's greatest strength was not any particular skill or technology, but rather the fundamental human drive to overcome obstacles through creativity and determination. In the command center, Admiral Kess reviewed intelligence reports with her staff, and the war was turning, and for the first time in 12 years, the Coalition was gaining ground against the Draviks, and colony worlds were being liberated, and enemy hives were collapsing, and the tide had shifted. But Kess was experienced enough to know that the Draviks would respond, and that they would adapt, and that humanity had given the Coalition an advantage, but keeping that advantage would require constant evolution and innovation, and she wondered if they were ready for what came next. Greg reported visual contact with the target, and he said the Hive mothership was massive with organic curves that looked grown rather than built, and he counted 47 Draviks warriors on the exterior hull alone, and probably thousands inside. Danny said they only needed to reach one. They came alongside the Hive mother vessel and matched its velocity, and the plan called for a docking maneuver disguised as routine resupply, and if it worked, they would board without raising alarms, and if it failed, they would have about 30 seconds before every Draviks in the fleet turned weapons on them. The docking clamps engaged with a metallic sound, and waiting for the airlock to cycle felt like forever. Jake finally said they were in, and he ordered all teams to execute. The strike force poured through the airlock into the Hive mothership, and they moved in perfect coordination, and humans and aliens worked as one organism, and Draviks warriors appeared, but the strike force cut them down with brutal efficiency. Sophie found a neural interface node and connected her systems directly to it, and she said she was in the enemy network, and that the amount of data flowing through was insane. Danny asked if she could locate the Hive. Mother Sophie said she was working on it, and then she reported that the ship biology was integrated with its computer systems in ways that seemed impossible, and she said the entire vessel was one massive organism, and then she paused and said she had found the target and gave coordinates 3 levels down in the central chamber, but she warned that the Hive mother knew they were there now, and the whole ship was waking up. The walls around them began to pulse and shift, and Draviks warriors emerged from passages that had not existed moments before. Jake ordered all teams to fight their way to the central chamber, and he said they would complete the mission or die trying. They battled through corridor after corridor, and each passage was a desperate fight, and Ben deployed explosive charges to collapse routes behind them and slow the pursuing enemies. They reached the central chamber and found the Hive mother waiting, and she was enormous and grotesque and a fusion of biological and technological elements, and her neural network was visible through translucent flesh, and it pulsed with coordination signals, controlling the entire Draviks fleet. Greg raised his rifle and said, "Target identified." But the Hive mother was faster than anticipated, and she unleashed a psychic scream that dropped half the team to their knees, and only the humans with their limited psychic sensitivity remained standing. Lisa muttered, "That was why they needed humans, and they were resistant to telepathic attacks." Danny's team opened fire, but the Hive mother personal shields absorbed every shot, and she was too powerful and too well defended. Danny shouted for Sophie and said he needed options. Sophie was still connected to the neural network, and she said if she could overload the Hive mother neural pathways, it would drop the shields. But she needed direct physical contact with the central cortex. Danny asked how direct. Sophie said physical contact. Direct. Danny looked at the Hive mother, surrounded by shields and protected by hundreds of warriors and screaming psychically, with enough force to kill unprotected minds, and approaching her seemed impossible. But Danny Wright had built an entire career doing impossible things. He told Lisa to cover him. Lisa started to protest, but he was already moving and sprinting toward the Hive Mother, while his team laid down covering fire, and Dravik's warriors tried to intercept. But Grexis and the Voltharian commandos formed a living wall, and their armor-absorbed hits meant for Danny. Danny reached the shield perimeter and it burned his skin on contact, but he pushed through and his modified armor dispersed just enough energy to keep him alive, and he grabbed onto the Hive Mother, massive form, and found purchase on organic ridges. He shouted for Sophie to act now. Sophie triggered the virus through her connection, and the Hive Mother systems went haywire, and her shields flickered, and in that instant, Danny drove his combat knife into what Sophie had identified as her central neural cortex. The Hive Mother psychic scream became a death shriek that echoed through every Dravik's mind in the entire fleet, and then there was silence. Above them in space, 3,000 Dravik's vessels suddenly stopped their coordinated approach, and ship commanders found themselves autonomous after years of following the Hive Mother will, and they were confused and unable to coordinate and reverting to individual behaviors. The coalition fleet struck with devastating effect, and the battle was not even close, and the Dravik ships fighting as independent units were destroyed systematically by coalition forces that had learned to fight with human cunning, and the enemy armada was annihilated. The war was over,